So my brother died.
Sleep. Sorry, I have terminal lung cancer.
Yeah, that wasn't a joke. He's dead. In reality, though, I was unsatisfied with how the past videos turned out, so I decided to just change the entire format. So let's get into today's first episode, episode 13, Fullmetal vs. Flame. So originally, this fight between Ed and Mustang was a gag chapter in the manga, and it's really cool to see how they integrated it into the 2003 anime. I like how it was grounded in a detail of the world that was brought up in the Shao Tucker storyline, the State Alchemy Certification Assessments. It makes this feel more like a tightly written plot rather than the show just trying to find an excuse to include this in the story. The show turns this pretty funny fight into genuine conflict between Ed and Mustang and uses it to further explore their dynamic. Ed wants to learn more about Marco, but Mustang won't tell him what he knows. There's some great visual storytelling in this episode too. After Mustang cockblocks Ed by not telling him what he needs to know, we go to the cafeteria, and after a brief chat with Hughes, the iron-blooded alchemist comes in and gives Ed a bit of information regarding Marco. And then it cuts to Mustang answering a question that we don't see Ed asking, but we don't need to because of the context of the last scene. Mustang responds by saying, "Don't know him, sorry," and it immediately cuts to the library where Ed is digging through books and trash-talking Mustang at the same time. It's a really efficient way to showcase what kind of relationship the two of them have and how Ed reacts to the shady things Mustang does. Speaking of efficient storytelling, Al decides to bring in a cat from the rain, and after he runs off because Ed wouldn't let him keep it, he flashes back to a scene of child Ed trying to pull the same shit on their mom. And when the flashback fades out, we see Ed looking reflectively on Mustang's couch, which shows that they were both thinking about the same thing. I also like how the contemplative music in the background gets interrupted by Mustang's smug voice. Again, it really shows what kind of influence he has in the kid's life. I've talked about a lot of the drama in this episode, but there are a lot of lighthearted moments in this episode too. Like, a lot of them. There's Mustang's miniskirt speech, which could probably land him a position in Activision, but there's also a pretty funny B-plot about Fury trying to find an owner for this dog, and all the potential candidates are either disinterested in the idea of owning one or batshit crazy. The exception being Mustang, who only really seems to like dogs because you don't have to pay them, and he goes on this rant about how loyal dogs are and all that. Andrew Tate would fucking love this guy. There's this funny bit where Mustang says that he wasn't worried about Ed trying to beat the shit out of him because there's no way the Fuhrer would allow such a fight to occur, only for an immediate cut to the Fuhrer saying, "Sounds interesting, I'm going to allow it." It's a funny little moment, but it's also an efficient way to progress the main plot of this episode. And then there's the fight itself. It's fucking hilarious. I like the way the show handles comedy. I think in the last part of this series we talked about this briefly, but this fight is a perfect example of what we were talking about. Look at this part of Ed running away from Mustang's flames. His face is really comedic and over the top, but there's no wacky or cartoon background. We're still in the same battle arena, and there's this realistic weight to how Ed runs through these explosions. Same with these guys flying into the air. What's happening to them is over the top, but the way they get shot up into the air is grounded in this sense of realism and how they move. I really like this shot here of the crowd just looking dead and slowly looking up as Ed makes a giant ass cannon. It's fucking great. On top of that, the show handles tonal shifts from over-the-top comedy to more serious drama perfectly. It's not like it abruptly switches gears out of nowhere. There's this bit after all of the explosions where there's a bunch of dust in the air, there's no music, and Mustang just approaches Ed while he's coughing. It's this silent moment that prepares the audience for this really smooth edit that's almost jarring with how clean the transition is. And the way it burns away to show Ed retaliating in an instant, which actually foreshadows what happened in that scene he was flashing back to, is fucking brilliant. I like this setting of the two of them just cleaning up after the fight. There's this really cool feel to it, especially with the sunset in the background and all the rubble on the ground. It's perfect for this reflective scene coming up. The flashback is great. I particularly like the shot here of Mustang's shadow being accentuated by the light of his flames. The way the shadow is positioned indicates exactly what happened when combined with the timing of the flame. It manages to be genuinely chilling and scary without having to actually show a burnt fucking corpse. The episode ends perfectly too, showing the resolution of two different storylines, cutting between two scenes of Mustang talking to Hughes in a bar and Ed and Al leaving the cat they found to hopefully be adopted by someone else. I like how when Hughes brings up what happened in Lior, Mustang tries to shelter Ed by hiding the information from him, doing the same shit he did at the beginning of the episode. This line here, "He'll learn soon enough, we always do," is fucking awesome. It's just an interesting dynamic the two of them have. You can tell that Mustang genuinely cares for the kid, but he doesn't tend to go about things in the best way, which causes a lot of problems. The other scene of Ed and Al building a little baby carriage for this cat is really great too. It further cements cements the lesson that he learned as a kid in episode 7, that he can't do everything, and sometimes a little thing like this is the best he can do. It also shows how Ed's changed over the 3 years he spent in the military. Again, this episode does a perfect job of using and tying in this charming but otherwise pointless little gag that was in the manga. So those are all the major talking points I wanted to cover, so here's a scene that wasn't really related to any of them but deserves some recognition. The scene of the Führer's secretary completely disproves the thought that the 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist anime only diverged from the manga story because they ran out of material. They planted these plot points into the story way before the point they had gone anime original, which shows that they were always planning to go for this kind of story the show would eventually turn into. If you want to pull something completely out of your ass and say, nope, this was just a massive coincidence, well, the way Ed looks at her and the show specifically draws attention to her proves otherwise. The show intentionally draws suspicion to her and asks the audience to keep this in mind. So yeah, a really great episode. Talking about it made me realize that I loved it a lot more than I remembered, so I'm gonna give this one a 10. It's honestly a perfect episode that ends on a cliffhanger which goes directly into the next. Speaking of, episode 14, Destruction's Right Hand. It starts off on what Hughes was alluding to in Lior. It's a really screwed up situation, and I like the way it cuts between lust and envy talking over scenes of Ed and Al looking around, and the scene at the bar where Hughes and Mustang are talking about the same thing, the hero killer. I mean, the state alchemist killer Scar. It's a good way of establishing information without the setting getting stale, and it shows that the villains are also wary of what's happening in the military. I like the change the show made to the manga. Instead of Ed and Al just randomly coming across Marco, they just go straight to his house after tracking him down. This feels more tightly written in comparison to the weird progression of the order of the events in the manga. In their search for Marco, they use this as an opportunity to introduce Armstrong. I like this introduction, how Ed starts off being wary of the guy, and the way it gets paid off at the end when Armstrong comes in to save them from Scar. You know, there's something kind of funny about the way Al just walks up to a raised gun and scares the shit out of this guy. It's a pretty cool scene, but every time I see it, I just like to imagine Al working in the mafia or something. The way he presses himself up against the gun to show that he's hollow in the inside is fucking great, and I like the way that Marco doesn't say anything like, "What? You're hollow?" He just mistakes him for the Fullmetal Alchemist, and the scene moves on after Ed corrects him. This whole talk with Marco is cool too. There are several things done in this conversation that a lot of people can learn from, like when Marco starts talking about the Ishvalan rebellion, the anime doesn't just flash back to the event being referred to, they instead show the conflict happening in Lior. This does two things at the same time. It gives the audience a good idea of the kind of carnage that happened in Ishval while simultaneously showing that history is repeating itself. This is also another good example of tonal shifts done right. There's this one point where Marco calls Ed small, and there's no change in music or even an overblown reaction. We just see Ed flailing as the camera pans over to Marco on the other side of the table, continuing the conversation.
You're way too small for these concerns. I bet you were blinded by the abundant privileges, access to research and prestige, so you joined their ranks.
It's still grounded in the same atmosphere and reality as it was before, which doesn't make it that jarring. There's also a cool shot here where Al tells Marco about how the people of Xenotime are fine and the red water is cleared up, which causes Marco to look over to the wall instinctively. Then Ed looks at him surprised and runs over to the wall to reveal what was hidden there. From these two simple reaction shots of the characters, we're able to clearly tell what each of them are thinking, and it's a cool little moment of deductive reasoning from Ed. When the iron-blooded alchemist comes in, he reveals what the red substance was, and Ed asks about the specs and all of the logistics behind it, and I like that. It kind of goes back to one of the themes of episode 7, how curiosity and a desire for knowledge can be a really dangerous thing, and it shows that even after 3 years, that part of him is still very present. And then at the end, he gives Marco back the stone because he recognizes how much he's helped people, which makes for a nice little moment between the two of them. The entire scenario is reminiscent of the whole Nina incident, how the iron-blooded alchemist is taking someone away, and how Ed can't do anything about it. And when Marco is being pulled away, the camera doesn't focus on him. It's like Ed doesn't want to look at him bitching and being all pathetic, but he's instead forced to look at the crowd of people watching anxiously as one of their most beloved people gets taken away from them. Again, the show does a good job putting you into the perspective of Ed and what he's thinking about. There's a flashback to what happened with Nina here, which wasn't really necessary though. I think the parallels were enough to get that point across, but if they were going to have Ed say, maybe I haven't grown an inch since then, but I can't let my heart stay stunted too, it would be pretty confusing if they didn't firmly establish what he was talking about. He still hasn't completely let go of what happened to Nina, and considering what happens to Marco in the end, this is a much more tragic line than it seems on the surface. It's here that we see Scar for the first time. Throughout the episode, we would get glimpses of what he did to those poor soldiers, and the way these corpses look is fucking scary. It really makes you afraid of Scar and sets up the main source of tension for the episode, and when he actually shows up, he does an incredible job of cementing himself as a genuine threat. He kills the iron-blooded alchemist who up until this point had been portrayed as this hulking figure of authority that Ed couldn't do anything about, and he kills that guy in an instant. Scar in this episode is weird though. He's intimidating, but but he also mixes in these religious words into his speech, and it's not a bad thing per se. I mean, it makes sense given who he is, but I find him a lot more interesting when he just drops this whole shtick. It's like he's trying to make himself more interesting and stand out from the crowd of other serial killer characters, but he doesn't really need to. I don't know if I really care for the way Scar brings up the fact that he had a brother either. I like how it creates a personal connection between the Elric brothers and Scar, and how it leads to some good tension when Scar threatens to kill Al, but the way he starts talking about it feels kind of random, like he just wanted to talk about his brother with someone and didn't even try to find a good segue into the whole thing. I did like how we got to see what happened to Rose after everything in episode 2 though. When Rose is repeating Ed's words of wisdom to her, they cut back to Ed, Al, and Marco running away from Scar again, which is a good way to remind the audience, oh shit, that's what Ed said. It accomplishes much more than a flashback, and it doesn't get in the way of the story progression or waste any time. And it's a good lead into the final scene of the episode where Ed tells Marco the same thing he told Rose, just in a different wording so he won't be caught for plagiarism. Overall, this is a good episode, but there are some problems I had with it, so it's like a 9 out of 10. Next is episode 15, the Ishbal Massacre. I love the rainy atmosphere of this episode. It's the perfect mood for this sequence of Ed, Marco, and Al sneaking around and trying to avoid the military as much as possible. I always love it when anime does stuff like this, when something happens and the protagonists are forced into situations where they have to hide from some authority figures. It's a really cool scenario. The three of them come across a bunch of worthless peasants playing in some ghetto back alley dump, and Marco gets all depressed for some reason. It's probably not that serious. I like the way this scene that the show cuts to seems like a completely different thing at first, but actually ends up building on the previous one, further exploring the reason why Scar is trying to kill a bunch of state alchemists. This shot right here is just awesome. After Hughes tells the rest of the group what happened to the iron-blooded alchemist, Fury's all like, oh shit, he was an expert in hand-to-hand combat or whatever, and Hughes shrugs him off and tilts his head to signal something to Mustang. It gives the audience a clear sign of what he's thinking and the way his relationship with Mustang works. It's also just really cool, the kind of thing I do while playing pretend by myself and thinking, man, anime is so fucking cool. This episode has a really good structure. Every scene is designed to just keep giving you more information about the situation. I like the way this flashback keeps getting interrupted by the scene of these kids playing. It gives the impression that this flashback is actually coming from someone's perspective, someone who gets distracted by what's actually happening in front of him and being brought back to Earth occasionally while telling his story. I really like this transition here where mud splashes on this girl's shirt because it's so jarring. It's obviously supposed to remind you of blood, you know, representing violence and all that, but it's done so smoothly that its abruptness adds the secondary effect of this news just kind of hitting you out of nowhere. There's some really evocative imagery being used in this episode. The way the shot is lit and composed is fucking great. It's not overly gruesome either. There are no dead bodies in this shot. All you can see is the destruction left after the massacre, destroyed homes, rubble. I always find myself getting carried away by the music when I see this. One problem I have with this though is that they go a bit overboard with making the alchemist look evil, aside from Mustang, who's the only person to show some kind of remorse here. Like, they have Kimberly laughing maniacally, which I guess is fitting for the guy, but then they make the iron-blooded alchemist do the same thing, which I felt was a bit much. Like, I get it, okay? Even Armstrong looks cold as fuck here, but I guess his portrayal here is much more justified given the fact that we don't know him so well by this point, so they make him take more of a neutral reaction rather than one of the two extremes. This episode takes a page out of episode 13's book and uses a fade out to reveal Scar looking contemplatively up at the sky, following up where we last saw him, and like in Fullmetal vs. Flame, this is a good way to show that Scar and Marco were thinking about the same thing. Though we don't get to see Scar's perspective because he's interrupted by some soldiers who spot him. Look at how he's just chilling here. He probably would have kept reminiscing long enough for us to see his side of things if these assholes hadn't interrupted him. It's like they're trying to cover up what happened to him personally and make it harder for the audience to sympathize with him by hiding crucial information. It kind of speaks to the shadiness of the military, an effect that I think was intentional given how Marco shed light on their darker side only moments earlier, and the fact that the Fuhrer basically tells Mustang to bury the motherfucker.
My ankle!
You know, I always get a kick out of how he says that. It's just so dramatic. Like, oh fuck, my ankle! This fucking harmonica, man. I can't be the only one who finds it a bit distracting. Like, generally speaking, it's fine. It's grown on me a lot since I first watched the show, but come on. It fit episode 13 a lot better when they had visuals that I felt actually matched the overpowering nature of the song. But here, I feel a more quiet atmosphere would have suited this better, especially if they were trying to sell how cold the military was. On the same train of thought, this picture being here is kind of weird. I would have let it slide if it was just a detail in the scene, but the zoom in is what makes it a bit much for me. I like this shot of Mustang dropping the alcohol and you can see that the bodies have been cleaned up. That's something that's actually kind of fucked up. I like the scene overall, but there are some details that I just wish they had done better or put a little more thought into. The change they made to the manga where it was actually Mustang who killed Winry's parents on military orders is great, and we'll talk more about how they handle this down the line. But back to this episode, this change makes the story feel so much more brutal and doesn't give Ed an easy out by making the serial killer the culprit. He actually has to come to terms with the corrupt and shady decisions made by the people he works for. They also do a pretty good job of making Marco's actions feel organic in the order of events that transpire, since after learning about Ed's connection to the Rockbells, he runs off, giving both Scar and the military enough time to catch up with them and ultimately lead him to his doom. As is the case with Nina, Ed is partially responsible for what happened to Marco, since if he hadn't mentioned the Rockbells, they would have been able to sneak out by now, the little shit. When Scar lands in between Ed and Marco, he looks at Ed for a few seconds and then immediately turns to go after Marco. You can tell that he didn't expect Ed to be here, but after he registered that fact, he realized that Marco was probably nearby too, and once he saw him, he went for the throat. This interaction is short, but again, you can tell exactly what the characters are thinking here. I like how sluggishly Ed fights here. It looks a little awkward and it shows how inexperienced he is compared to Scar. You can really sense the time being wasted with each attack, something that he'll learn to stop doing as the series continues. I love how Ed's face looks here after his arm gets destroyed. You know, this show is great because it manages to be profound, but it appeals to the most basic human urges. All these characters look cool as fuck no matter what they're doing. The scene of Ed sacrificing his life for Al will always be great. I really like this part specifically. Ed asks Scar why he's killing so many people when he knows that it won't bring his brother back, and when it cuts to his face, he just doesn't answer and raises his arm to kill him. It's great. It's clearly telegraphed that he knows Ed is right, and he doesn't really have a response, but he just doesn't care because he's so angry. And obviously, we need to talk about the aftermath. This punch looks really cool. I don't condone child abuse, but fuck, this looks great. There's no music playing here. There's just the sound of the rain in the background. It's quiet, and this argument doesn't feel like it's being treated as a joke. When Al's arm falls off, it feels grounded in the same reality like I talked about with the stellar approach to humor in this show. It's jarring, but it doesn't completely shatter the reality of the moment. It also helps the dialogue in the scene feels naturalistic, like these are words actually coming out of a human being's mouth. This episode ends on one of the best ending scenes in the entire show. After learning that it was the military who shot up Winry's parents, the Führer's secretary comes to take Marco away, and because she's a bit far, Al can only hear her voice slightly and says he heard his mom's voice, to which Ed responds,
"Come on, Al, you just had a brush with death. Don't go unstable on me now."
with the beautiful ending theme playing in the background. The way it focuses on Ed's dejected face at the end. This is how you cap off an episode. This is fucking awesome. Had some problems, but overall, 9 out of 10. And I prefer this one to the previous episode a bit more. Moving on to episode 16, That Which Is Lost, we can immediately see that what Marco told the Elrics is affecting them. At least it's affecting Ed, who's a lot more distrustful than his brother. The scene of Armstrong being selected as Ed's bodyguard was originally just a funny joke used to push the plot along, but here it's used to establish what this episode will be about, Ed's distrust of the military, explored through the slow progression of his relationship with Armstrong. I like the scene and how it frames Ed's change in perspective over the course of the episode. Every time someone says something to Ed, like Havoc cracking a joke about how useless he is without his arm, or Armstrong being fucking weird, Ed just kind of ignores them, and they telegraph what he's thinking through simple reaction shots like these before he continues what he was saying. It shows that Ed's probably really conflicted. All of these people seem incredibly human, and even though he may not see eye to eye with Mustang specifically, there is some kind of established trust between them. I like the way that the scene eventually becomes warmer as it continues on. By the end of it, Ed is somewhat back to his snarky attitude, and he's actually reacting to something that Armstrong does now as opposed to the beginning where he just didn't give a fuck. This interaction between Hughes and Ed is pretty fun, but then it takes a dark turn when Hughes drops the bomb and tells Ed about Scar killing Nina. Ed gives this really twisted smile, and I just feel sad whenever I see it. You know he's lost something when he doesn't even react anymore, and he just talks about what he's gonna do to Scar. Hughes' smile here is just as bad, like he knows what just happened was fucked up. The scene has multiple purposes too. The way they use this newspaper kid is great. He shows up at the beginning and then Hughes tries to shoo him away. What is he, a cat or something? But the little shit doesn't leave. He just stands there like an idiot. And you know, that's kind of weird, but the anime cuts to a close-up shot of Ed and Hughes, so he was probably only there to make this world seem more alive or whatever. You know, by this point in the conversation, he's not important anymore. You're probably thinking about it a little as the scene continues, but the bombshell with Nina takes the focus of the scene, so any lingering suspicion is gone by this point, until we see that this little piece of shit is still here. And then he gasps and you instantly put it together, and if you didn't, this next scene will do it for you. This is a really great way to start moving characters around and give the audience context to their actions. It's the same as the next scene of Les paying Marco a visit. By the way the scene cuts off, you know that Marco told Les where he left his research, which is the same place that Scar is going, setting up a confrontation in the future. Also, I love how this scene subtly hints at the corruption of the military. You're already kinda suspicious of them because of the Ishbal massacre, some unsettling scenes of the Fuhrer, and hey look, there's Ed's mom. But when you think about this scene more, you go, wait, how did this woman sneak into a military guarded facility housing someone who's an infinitely important figure in their work? You'd expect at least a little resistance, but when she walks in, there's nothing that implies that she had trouble getting in here. The reason? Because it turns out the military is working with these monstrous creatures. The halfway point of this episode is where we start to have conflict between Armstrong and Ed. When Al goes missing, Armstrong looks at the problem calmly and has a very by-the-book method of trying to locate him. This rubs Ed the wrong way since he's overcome with worry for his brother. I like this moment on the train where Ed is trying to jump out the window, but Armstrong tries to stop him, tearing off his pants. That sounds weird. And revealing his metal leg. Obviously this comes back up later when this little girl spots the metal leg and decides to rob Ed, but there's some more meaning to this. His leg is a reminder of the mistakes he made in the past, how he acted rashly and ignored other people's warnings, choosing to make massive assumptions to bring back someone he cared about. And he's doing something similar here. When you look at this episode as a whole, Ed makes a massive assumption about all the people he's come to know based on a fact he learned about them, and as a result he starts to butt heads with them. The scene of Armstrong being reminded about what he did at Ishbal always makes me feel bad for the guy. By this point in the story, we don't know him that well, but this shot of his face shows genuine regret and heartache, which, given what we know about the massacre, it's hard not to sympathize with him. What the fuck is wrong with this family? This guy wants to use Al as armor to kill people. I would hate him if they had focused on his story more, but the writers were smart and just turned him into a joke. This girl knocks the shit out of Ed and somehow knows how to detach an automail leg. They're fucking bizarre. The old guy is the only one who doesn't seem to be a psychopath. Unsurprisingly, he's the one who has the most compelling drama attached to him. He's a soldier who lost his leg, and he sheds more light on what kind of hell the soldiers and state alchemists have been through. That's probably the point where Ed was like, oh yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking too deep about this whole thing. He also goes into this whole dreams versus reality theme that becomes a focal point of the story, and Ed's flawed perception of equivalent exchange. His dialogue is some of the most gripping shit ever. He's just a one-time character, but he's more memorable and leaves a bigger impact on me than any character from Brotherhood. I like how this scene is directed. It starts off very quiet and the only noise in the background is the sound of the wind blowing against the window. Even when the music comes in and uses the harmonica, it's not distracting. It still has that very quiet, reflective feel to it. But the music does get louder once Ed starts being overcome by his emotions. The shot composition here is amazing. This shot of the clock showing a reflection of the conversation the two of them are having while having a visual indicator to remind you of the State Alchemist pocket watch is great. I pointed out that the last time Ed cries in the show was the Bury the Chopper incident, where he breaks down after his brush with death, which is a subtle detail that sells the fact that over the years Ed's lost something in him that's very human, and it only comes back once Al sacrifices himself and starts to cry on the other side of the gate. In this scene he starts to tear up but restrains himself from crying. We know this because the show cuts before we see his tears falling, and when the camera goes back to him, he's not shedding any tears. The way he knocks over the glass of tea and it starts dripping onto the floor is like the scene crying for him because he doesn't do it himself. Once the soldier drops the line, the pleasure of a dream is that it's a fantasy or whatever, the show holds on the shot as the music starts to fade out and the sound of the wind returns as the reality of what he said hits Ed full on. And once Ed speaks again, he has no choice but to acknowledge the truth of what he just heard. But even though he does, he still wants to chase the dream. I love this shot of Ed getting up from the table and leaving. As he exits, we're just left with the sound of his footsteps and the door closing. It's great. There's this really lonely feeling to the way he walks off. It's like how you feel after an argument with someone, I don't know. This part where the dumbass kid runs into the house is pretty cool. It ties together all the characters in this episode in a funny way and serves as a reminder of what Ed was trying to do before he got mugged and fucked up by a dose of reality. Once Ed and Al are reunited, that's when the end of the episode comes up. Ed's carrying Al on a wagon, and wow, look at that sunset. I fucking love how that looks. The way they draw this is perfect for the kind of warm but pensive scene they're going for here. I like how the first thing Ed says in the scene is that Alphonse stinks like shit, and the two of them actually feel like brothers ribbing each other before going into the real drama. You can tell that Ed is still kind of distrustful of the military here, only for his baggage to literally be lightened by the arrival of Armstrong. It's a good visual indicator to show that Ed's at least become more open-minded towards the military guys. apologized. He may not fully trust them still, but he understands that people like Armstrong do care about him. The scene is really touching. The way Ed apologizes and Armstrong reacts is so wholesome. I like the way it gets interrupted by the sound of the train, and the infectious upbeat energy immediately bleeds into the scene as Armstrong picks up Ed and Elle and rushes off to the train. It feels great and shows that the two of them have reconciled without needing to put it into words. 9 out of 10. It's a great episode, but you can tell that some of the events weren't nearly as thought out as others, like this guy who's training to be a murderer. I don't like the fact that everything about him is just told to us through uninteresting dialogue and scenes of him biking around. Anyways, overall, a great batch of episodes, that's all, and I'll be going now.